Welcome back. In the first week of July, two children lost their lives due to vehicle accidents, bringing the total number of child fatalities to 101 in the Vision Zero era. This unfortunate occurrence led the organization Families for Safe Streets to release a report titled Why New York Must Design Streets for Children, along with a website honoring every child who lost their life in traffic accidents. Organizers are now saying New York City must prioritize redesigning its streets with child safety in mind. Joining me to discuss this effort is Bronx and Uptown Organizer for Transportation Alternatives, Jada Yeboah. Jada, thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, thank you. I wish it was under happier circumstances, but I
Right.
am happy to be here as well.
Now, can you just provide some insight into the events that prompted the creation of the report, Why New York City Must Design Streets for Children?
So we've just been seeing a record level of children being not just killed, but like horribly maimed and just in terrible car accidents that specifically often are in communities of color, that we've noticed that the community, like that the governmental bodies that be just do not seem to pay attention. And that this was a way to kind of put pressure on not just like the council members and the city board and the community boards, but also the mayor to respond to these, quite frankly, very horrifying incidents of like child mutilation and child like death that like we have been seeing again, specifically in mostly Black and brown communities. So this was a way to just at least put pressure to, show the people of New York City what is actually happening, give some kind of like a pressure push to have a conversation that leads to safer streets for children.
Now, for background information, can you just talk about Vision Zero era and what that actually is?
So it's complicated. In terms of trying to create safer streets, trying to like implement more busways and greenways to alleviate the pressure of the car resiliency in New York City. We're trying to kind of like move away from that, create a space where it's just a lot more pedestrian friendly and car unfriendly. I don't know if that's a term, but I will be using that for this conversation. Car unfriendly is really how I try to think of Vision Zero, a way of moving New York City into an era in which, there are just much more like choices and much more other kind of routes for pedestrian friendly modes of transportation.
Now, the report mentions the increase in the number of vehicles as a factor that has impacted the safety of children on New York City streets. Can you provide a detailed explanation of just the report in general?
Yeah, of course. So we're seeing more cars on the streets, and not just that, we're seeing an increase in the weights and of these cars. We're seeing about 60% of the new car registrations in New York City are SUVs and trucks. These are big cars; they're not little. I'm from North Carolina, like I know what a truck is like, And so a lot of times, like it is not just that we are seeing an increase in car prevalence and like car culture in New York City, but like in the conversation of safe streets for children, we're seeing heavier cars, and so these instances of like accidents are going to just be a lot more dangerous because like these cars are just a lot heavier, they weigh more, it's harder to like stop, it's harder to brake, like there's more gas to them. So we're seeing cars that like not just more cars in general, but cars are not necessarily compatible for a New York City street. And so that is a big concern for a lot of like kind of like the main findings in the article is that, we are seeing more cars, but the type of car we're seeing as well is very, very much like dangerous and counterproductive to creating like safe streets for children.
Now, I'm not sure if this was explored, but was there any view on like how possibly COVID or the pandemic has impacted this? Because I know that since a lot of people were afraid of like being in public, a lot more people were driving cars, especially with everything that was going on the subways. More people felt safer in cars. Did you see any like correlation between the two, or was that something that your organization looked at?
Yeah, see, I think that conversation is an equity conversation as well, because I think that like we live in a very individualistic world, and COVID was a big factor in that. It was harder to like social distance in the subways. It's harder to do a lot of these things, but it's not impossible. And I think that when we talk about creating safe, much more like accessible modes of transportation, when we speak about incidents on subways, a lot of times like those incidents are, unhoused folks that are causing problems, or, not wanting to be around the poverty that exists in New York City. And I think a lot of times, like, that is the narrative that is used to push a very, very specific kind of like very isolating culture that not a lot of people can afford cars. You know what I mean? Most people in New York City do not utilize cars to get to where they needed to get to. So what about all those folks, And so, like, when we talk about COVID, I think it is important to also talk about how a lot of times that rhetoric of, social distancing, and this is not to say you shouldn't always social distance, of course, they're seeing an uptick, so got to do that. But like, we also see how, like, a lot of times, like, these conversations are very much woven into this kind of like, oh, well, I don't want to be around those kind of people. Like, it's just not safe. It's dirty. And I think dirty is a big thing that, like, I've heard a lot of times in that conversation. It's like, oh, the subway is dirty, or like the people are dirty. And a lot of times that's just code for like unhoused folks that you just don't want to be around, or certain kinds of like, certain kinds of people that you don't want to be around. I don't want to get into the conversation of like mental illness and like, creating space for that. But I do think a lot of times, like, that is a segue that it happens. And so it's like, no, it's easier to be in my car. And we have to talk about like the levels of privilege that occur just in that, like, that phrasing of like, well, I feel safer in the car. Well, why do you feel safer in the car? You know what I mean?
Right.
Why don't you feel safe on the subway?
I want to add to that, or I know you kind of mentioned it also, like how 65% of children were killed by larger vehicles. Can you just expand on, like why that was such an important thing to look at? And I think that, like, when people hear about a car crash, they're not normally thinking about the, the size of the car. But can you actually talk about like why, an SUV or a van or a truck, why that's important when we look at these unfortunate events?
Yeah, of course. I think I kind of mentioned it a little bit earlier in the sense of like these cars are like not super compatible for the city. So it's not just that, they take up more space. They're not great on gas. Like, it's just a lot more emissions that happen with these cars. And on top of that, it's just when we talk about like transit equity, which is kind of like what TA does, there's a lot more to it than just cars. We talk about like infrastructure. We talk about climate resiliency. We talk about, safe streets for children. I think that like the emphasis on the SUVs kind of explore, and trucks, of course, explore all these kind of tenets of like, okay, it is bad for children because, it weighs more. When you hit a child, a small child, it's going to cause like a much more intense kind of and traumatic like impact. Second of all, they're not super like climate resilient. A lot of times these cars like need a lot of gas, produce a lot of emissions, and like they also just take up a lot of space on the parking spot, like in parking spaces for like, bikers who may not be able to like be accessible for them because there's a huge truck like parked there. Like, and we can also talk about the fact that like, again, specifically in the Bronx, because I'm the Bronx Uptown Organizer, we don't see as many like protected bike lanes. We don't see those things. And so these cars are going to be parking where like bikes are going to be, where, scooters are going to be, where people are walking. And so a lot of times, like, it's just this, I think that like the weight of the car and the type of car is just very emblematic on just like a lot of the different kind of like intersectionalities and like that happen within the conversation on transit equity.
Now, as we mentioned, this was a part of a larger effort to get the city to kind of look at what's actually happening. What are some of the actions that New York City can actually take to address the changing nature of vehicle traffic?
Well, there's quite a few, but I'll only talk about 2 or 3. I don't want to bore y'all, but I think that like one thing would be, making safe streets for children, specifically like a child. I'm missing my words right now, but like building like school streets. So streets that are, because we see again, like most accidents that happen around schools happen on that 8 a.m. Marker, which is, a lot of times like the time that children are coming in. And so that's a lot more dangerous. A lot of times too, we see that 43% of accidents that happen around schools are going to be happening in Black and brown communities. And so there is a racial conversation to this as well. And so to do that, I think that like in the spirit of Vision Zero, we must like create much more like accessible paths for pedestrian friendly / car free zoning for children. So making sure that there is no cars around schools, like it is a school street. We can find other ways to get children in and out of school. There's busing, there's biking. A lot of the committee members that I know like bike with their children and whatnot. And like we can talk about the accessibility conversation and also in maybe like what is it called? What is that word? I'm forgetting it, but we'll move on from that. I think that like making streets safe for children in the sense of no car should be around those schools. We shouldn't see cars around where children are going to be like running around because they're kids. You know, I have a little brother, he's 7. Like he's not thinking about like, let me look and turn. Like they're just going to be running around. And so creating that safe space for them, and also universal daylighting. So universal daylighting would be basically like removing parking spots from intersections. Okay. Making sure, like kind of I was saying earlier, like a lot of times like these cars, like they park there, and like not just parking there, but like driving into those intersections around schools specifically is a very dangerous kind of like thing that happens, because like again, these cars are huge. It's a lot more work to stop them, to break them. And
I do want to interject just really quickly, because as we're talking about all of this, I think it's so important, and I definitely want to highlight that there is a memorial for so many kids who were affected by this, and I definitely want people to know about it. Can you just talk about the memorial and, you know, why that was so important to include along with some of the work that you guys are doing right now?
Yeah, of course. So this was a lot of the conversation that happened around, you know, Sammy's Law, and like I want to give a big like shout out to specifically NTA, the Families for Safe Streets branch, because like they had been doing so much like mental and like emotional work that goes into this. And I feel like this kind of memorial was like an outpouring of that, a way to just kind of like, because we do like, there's a lot of data points, you know, there's a lot of like, yeah, like let's crunch the numbers and all these things, but we forget that this is a very human thing.
There's a lot of feeling involved with
and
this.
A lot of the people that are in the Families for Safe Streets have lost people. So this is like work that's kind of like igniting trauma that's already been there. And, you know, like, of course we have like, kind of like, along with like the memorial, we also have like a space for like families who have lost children, who have lost family members, to kind of come in and like speak and like have these kind of like therapeutic sessions, yoga sessions and whatnot. But I think that like a lot of that work it was almost kind of like a defiance in a sense, like just an emotional kind of release that like needed to happen, specifically because of like the kind of work that's happening and the kind of conversations that we are like engaging in. And so,
can you just tell people how they can just look at the website and like actually see the memorial?
Yeah, of course. I'm actually forgetting the website, but
okay, is it
transportation, okay. trandalts.org/FSS, Families for Safe Streets. And it should be up there.
Okay, and we'll also have it on the screen so that people can look at it. But I want to thank you so much for joining us. This isn't like a easy conversation to have. And as you mentioned, there's a lot of numbers and everything that goes along with it. So thank you so much for joining us and having this conversation.
Yeah, no, of course. I just really wanted it to be like a real face to it, because I think that like in the report, again, it's numbers, it's like words, and like it's important to have that kind of like research to back up what you're doing. But I also think it is very important to like realize that like these are people, you know, these are children, and these are like children in our community. Like it is very often so that like we are like the communities, Black and brown folks are neglected, will not often be getting that kind of like, you know, that special treatment. And so we have to talk about like what equity and like what transit equity really means and how we can really engage with that properly. But I'm done talking. I'm so sorry.
It's okay. Thank you so much. If you would like to learn more about Transportation Alternatives efforts to help protect our kids, please go to projects.transalt.org/100children. We've come to the end of our show today. I'd like to thank all of our guests for joining us and you, the viewers, for tuning in. If you missed any part of today's show, you can catch the recable cast at 5 and 10 p.m. on Optimum Channel 67 and Verizon Files Channel 33, or watch anytime on the web at bronxnet.org. You can catch a brand new episode of Open with Nir and Jaime on Wednesday and Rena Valentine on Friday. I'm Kibin Alleyne, wishing you and yours safety and wellness now and always. See you next time.